Are indigenous religions the religions practiced by indigenous people? Or can these two categories be separated? Let's discuss the matter further. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Angela Puca and welcome to my symposium. I'm a PhD and a university lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of esotericism, shamanism, paganism, indigenous religions, and all traditions that entertain some kind of magical practice or magical thinking. Today I will share with you the content of a contribution I wrote for the forthcoming volume Indigenous Religious Traditions in 5 Minutes, edited by Molly Bassett and Natalie Avalos, and published by Equinox. In my piece and in this video, I discuss whether a religion needs to be practiced by indigenous people to be deemed an indigenous religion. Some of the content and references will sound familiar, as I already addressed them in a previous video, and yet I need to reiterate them, as they are relevant to my argument. On to the topic now. In an attempt to delineate what might be the characteristics of an indigenous religion, James Cox identifies 3 main ones. The first being a focus on ancestors, which is found in beliefs, rituals, social practices, and makes kinship relations of significant importance. The second trait is the identification with one specific geographical area. This implies that the rituals and practices of an indigenous religion are not universally applicable, but rather contingent to the place within which they were developed, and that have generated their own cosmology. Key is also the means of transmission, for knowledge and practices are passed on orally rather than via books. For Cox, indigenous religions are those practiced by indigenous people. But this assimilation between the two is not as clear-cut as language may suggest, and has been challenged by more recent scholarship. The category of indigenous people is in fact a political classification aimed at identifying, protecting, and guaranteeing the rights of the people, now a minority, who inhabited a territory before its mass colonization occurred. According to the International Labour Organization and the United Nations, indigenous people are those original or first peoples of a place where they have been colonized. This category seems to be solely applicable to those countries where a massive wave of colonization occurred in a short period of time, and on such a large scale as to starkly demarcate a distinction between the before and after, the outsiders and the native people, the colonizer and the colonized. Consequently, that of indigenous people is an extremely useful political classification, which is contingent to specific geographical areas and subject to the legislation of the country taken into consideration. However, the category of indigenous people as geographically contingent and politically charged appears insufficient by itself to understand what indigeneity is when it comes to religion. If indigenous religions are those practiced by indigenous people, would Christianity be an indigenous religion when it becomes the dominant one within such communities? And what about indigenous beliefs and rituals practiced by people who are not or no longer considered to be indigenous? Lumping together indigenous religions and indigenous people risks to impair or influence the understanding of both and flattening all the nuances derived from their own fields of expression. For instance, since the definition of indigenous people is a political classification, contingent to a specific place and its legislation, keeping the people entangled to the religion might compromise a full grasp on what an indigenous religion is in its own right, due to it being dependent on one government's law. This would hinder the appreciation of possible underlying patterns across different indigenous religions from different countries, while equally limiting the perception of indigenous people as those who have to engage with one specific set of beliefs. A European indigenous practice may still exhibit traits associated to indigenous religions, such as the connection to the land, the centrality of kinship relations, and a community-centered approach. And even if we are to include as a trait that of being colonized, there is still the chance of encountering a cultural translation of such an element. As my fieldwork with the Italian tradition of segnature showed, there can be religious minorities forced to adapt and remain quietly underground due to a dominant religion and cultural system that oppose their existence. The minority living within the dominant culture, when it comes to religion, might become a system of practices not accepted by the domineering socio-theoretical framework that classifies them as the other from what is deemed to be the norm. For instance, the predominant paradigm in the Western society endorses a pre-assumed rationalism that dictates what is real, aka the measurable, repeatable, and standardized, and what is not real. As a consequence, those vernacular healers who cure illnesses are seen as delusional because the reality of those practices is outright denied. So, when this latter trait is found alongside a connection to the land and the spirits, a community-serving approach, and oral transmission of knowledge, it becomes clear how disentangling indigenous religions from indigenous people allows to keep the question open on whether such religious traditions may in fact classify as indigenous. The conversation on what constitutes an indigenous religion is still ongoing within academic circles, and I argue, along with other scholars, that decoupling the category from that of indigenous people would help the inquiry on the two groups, allowing for a more nuanced, accurate, and contextual understanding of both. So this is it for today's video. Please, if you like my content and want me to keep the academic fun going, consider supporting my work with a one-off donation on PayPal by joining memberships or my inner symposium on Patreon, where you will get access to lots of perks depending on the chosen tier. And if you did like this video, don't forget to smash the like button, share the video with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and activate the notification bell to be notified every time that I upload a new video. Thank you so much for being here, and stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.